All right, so you're curious about Kotlin Multiplatform, KMP, building apps that run on, well, everything. And you want to know, can it really go head-to-head with the big guns like Flutter and React Native? We're diving deep into an article by Elnatan Derek. He's a senior mobile engineer, and he lays out a pretty compelling case for KMP.
You know, what I find fascinating is how KMP isn't just about sharing like snippets of code here and there. It could actually change the entire game of how we build for different platforms, all while letting each platform keep its own strengths.
It's huge if it works as well as some people say. Okay, before we get ahead of ourselves, let's break it down. What is Kotlin Multiplatform in the simplest terms? Imagine this. You write all the core logic of your app just once. Think handling data, making network calls, all that behind-the-scenes stuff. Then, boom, you can use it on Android,
Sure.
iOS,
Yep.
even the web, potentially. That's the power of KMP.
And the real beauty of it is how it's all put together, how it's structured, using what are called source sets. So you've got your shared Kotlin code, right? That lives in the common source set. Then each platform, Android, iOS, whatever, each one gets its own source set for anything specific to just that platform. It's like this really well-organized toolbox where everything has its place.
And Direct really stresses how if you've already got an Android project, especially one using Kotlin and this thing called Jetpack Compose, switching to KMP is supposed to be pretty painless. If it's even half as easy as he makes it sound, that completely changes the game in terms of time and money.
That's the key, isn't it? Adaptability. Think about the businesses that thrived when everything changed. They were the ones that could pivot fast and use what they already had to their advantage. KMP brings that same agility to developers.
Now, this next part is what I find really interesting. Unlike, say, Flutter, which uses Dart, or React Native with its JavaScript, KMP sticks with Kotlin. So for developers who already know Kotlin, no need to become fluent in a whole new language. From your perspective, what kind of impact does that have?
Oh, it's huge for developer productivity. It's less mental juggling, less switching back and forth between languages in your head. And when you bring new people onto the team, onboarding is way faster. Plus, you're likely to run into fewer bugs, which, let's be honest, is always a good thing. It all feeds into this bigger trend we're seeing of streamlining the entire development process, making everything smoother and more efficient.
Absolutely. And it sounds like you've got choices with KMP, right? You're not locked into sharing everything. It's not all or nothing. You can share just the app's logic, or, if you want to, even share UI components using Compose Multiplatform.
Exactly. It's all about having the flexibility to choose what makes sense for the project. So let's say you're building, I don't know, a mobile game. You want to squeeze every bit of performance out of each device, give players a really tailored experience. KMP lets you do that. But on the flip side, maybe you're making a productivity app. Consistency is key. You want it to look and feel the same everywhere. In that case, sharing UI components with Compose Multiplatform could be the way to go.
And here's a big vote of confidence for KMP. Google is actually using it for their workspace apps. This really jumped out at me when I was reading DeRich's article.
Yeah, that's a pretty big deal. Having Google's stamp of approval on KMP just validates it. It says this isn't some experimental tech. This is production ready. This can handle the big leagues. And you can bet other companies are watching. This could be the start of a much wider adoption. And as more companies use KMP, that means more resources, more tools. It's like a snowball effect.
So we've got this exciting new technology, at least it feels new, right? And with big names like Google already jumping on board. But how does it actually stack up against, the heavyweights, the ones that have been around a while? I'm talking about Flutter and React Native. Direct definitely doesn't shy away from that comparison in the article.
Yeah, he's realistic about it. He acknowledges straight up, Flutter and React Native, they're not going anywhere. They've got a good foothold. They've been around longer, bigger communities, tons of resources, all of that.
But he seems to hint that KMP might actually have a secret weapon, at least potentially. And that weapon is performance.
Why does he think KMP could outperform in that area?
It all comes down to how each framework actually interacts with the nuts and bolts of your device.
Yeah.
So Flutter uses its own rendering engine and its own Dart runtime. React Native, it relies on a JavaScript bridge to talk to native components. And those are powerful approaches, don't get me wrong. But they do add extra layers.
Instead of a straight shot, it's more like taking a detour.
100%. You'll get there eventually, but it might be a little slower. And that's where KMP could really shine because it compiles to native code for each platform. And I do want to emphasize just how efficient that compilation process is. It can kind of sidestep those detours, talk directly to the device's hardware, potentially leading to, well, a smoother, faster experience for the user. That's awesome, in theory at least. But obviously, it's not just about performance, right? There's a bigger picture here. What about the developer community? How easy is it to learn this thing? How does KMP compare in those areas?
Well, Derek's pretty upfront about it. Flutter and React Native, they've got a head start, no question. Larger communities mean more people building tools, more libraries, more resources for new developers, that kind of thing.
Like the old saying, many hands make light work.
Exactly. Now, I'm not saying the KMP community is weak or anything. It's actually growing super fast, especially with Google backing it now. But it's more about potential versus, established presence.
Makes sense. So let's say I'm a developer, I'm new to all this. What's the learning curve like?
Well, that's where your existing team, their skills come into play. Because if you've got developers who already know their way around Kotlin, switching over to KMP, especially with Compose Multiplatform, it's going to feel a lot more natural, less of a learning curve. But if your team is full of JavaScript wizards, React Native might be the path of least resistance.
So it's like you use the right tool for the job.
Right.
Right. You wouldn't use a wrench to try to turn a screw.
Exactly. And I think that's the core of Derek's message. There's no one best solution here. It's all about figuring out what your priorities are, what this particular project needs, what your team strengths are, and making a judgment call.
So it sounds like what Derek is really pushing for is, like, don't just jump on the bandwagon. Think it through.
Yeah, he's not saying ditch Flutter or React Native. Not at all. It's more like put KMP on your radar. Give it a serious look, especially as it matures.
It feels like Kotlin Multiplatform really could shake things up. I mean, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but
It's got the potential, that's for sure. I mean, just being able to share that core logic, that's a big win right there.
Man.
But then being able to share UI components with Compose Multiplatform, that could be what really changes the game.
especially with companies like Google getting on board, that's a big deal.
Absolutely. Google using KMP for their own apps, their workspace apps. It says they trust it, right?
Yeah.
It says KMP can handle big, complex projects. It's not a toy.
So where does that leave us? Let's say I'm listening to this. What are the key things I should be thinking about when it comes to KMP?
Derek really makes you stop and think about what matters to you, like what gets you excited about KMP. Is it the performance boost? The idea that you can build things faster? Or maybe it's leveraging those Kotlin skills you've already got on your team.
So it's about knowing what KMP brings to the table and then saying, okay, does that actually line up with what I'm trying to do? Does it make sense for my situation?
Yeah, and the cool thing is, KMP, it's still early days. There's so much more to come. As more companies start using it, the community grows. Who knows what's possible, right?
It's like we're watching this whole new landscape unfold, and KMP's right there in the middle of it all.
Keep an eye on it. Play around with it. You might just end up building your next killer app with it.
Great advice to end on. That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.